Hi, colleagues. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us here today at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. For those who are joining in person, welcome. And for those who are joining online, welcome as well. My name is Peter Lowen. I'm the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here today on what is, as you know, the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We're very lucky to be here, to have the opportunity to live and to work and to thrive and to play here. And we should be appreciative of it every day, but maybe even particularly when we're reflecting on truth and reconciliation in the coming days. I'm going to get out of the way in a second. I want to turn it over to Ryan Ballett, the chair of political science, who's going to moderate today's activities. But before I do, since this is on the occasion of Lynette Ong's book launch, I wanted to say a couple of things. One is that Lynette published 2 books last year, but she's only doing 1 book launch. So that's decent of Lynette to do just one, but she's a remarkably productive scholar. And that's evidenced not only by the fact that she had 2 books come out last year, but by a very long record of scholarship. But if I could say something about Lynette's scholarship and the way she does it, I thought I might just say in front of you now that what really impresses me most about Lynette's work is that it reflects, I think, a unique combination of creativity and how she thinks about the questions she undertakes and how she gets data around them. It reflects the highest standards of rigor in various methodological types, but the highest standards of rigor in our discipline. It's work that is, you can imagine, courageous. To study repression in China is not is a slightly higher stakes affair than studying elections in Canada, like I do. So I really admire that courage that underwrites the industry that she brings to this. And the work is deeply important for us understanding what is obviously one of the most important countries in the world, and a country that in some ways we know less and less about as time goes on, as it closes off more and more from the world. So it's really makes us lucky and fortunate to have Lynette here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and the Asian Institute in the Department of Political Science. So I'm just so pleased that you've had this occasion to get together and hear about Lynette's work, and for her to be joined by some truly impressive scholars who are going to comment on it. It's not my job to moderate that and to introduce them. It's Ryan Ballett. So I'll just ask you to join me in a second in welcoming the chair of the Political Science program at St. George, Ryan Ballett. Ryan.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's really a pleasure to be here to celebrate the book by my colleague, Professor Lynette Ong. Lynette Ong's Outsourcing Repression, Everyday State Power in Contemporary China is a superb study of the Chinese state's use of violent gangsters and nonviolent actors to constrain, coerce, and mobilize Chinese citizens for specific political purposes. It shows, above all, that even in a massive state such as China, repression is an everyday exertion of power over everyday life, not a dramatic or episodic display. Professor Ong's examination of everyday power over life resonates with important theoretical questions, theoretical models of power proposed by figures such as Michel Foucault and Michael Mann. Professor Lynette Ong is professor of political science at the University of Toronto and is jointly appointed at the Asian Institute of the Munk School. And as I mentioned at a gathering earlier this year, Lynette Ong is our department's recipient, maybe even the first recipient of the 2-book award. She's recently published, as you just heard, The Street and the Ballot Box, which is a comparative study of political movements and electoral politics. That book shows that nonviolent, broad-based social movements, such as the clean election movement in Malaysia, can unify disparate political actors from opposition parties to civil society in order to bring about regime change. Lynette Ong's research is powerful, it's impressive, it's consistent, and it's courageous. It's been inspirational to our colleagues and students in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto and in the Munk School. So a very warm welcome to Lynette Ong. I'll also introduce the other speakers, a distinguished cast of scholars who will comment on Professor Ong's work. We have Professor Andrew Murtha, who is the George and Sadie Hyman Professor of China Studies, the Director of China Studies Program, and the Director of the China Global Research Center at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. His most recent book is called Brothers in Arms, Chinese Aid to the Khmer Rouge, 1975 to 1979. Secondly, we have Professor Min-Shin Pei, the Tom and Margot Pritzker 1972 Professor of Government and George R. Roberts Fellow at Claremont McKenna College. Professor Pei is the author of numerous books, most recently, China's Crony Capitalism, The Dynamics of Regime Decay from Harvard University Press. Finally, we have Professor Dan Slater, the Ronald and Eileen Weiser Professor of Emerging Democracies, Director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, and Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Professor Slater's latest book, co-authored with our very own Professor Joseph Wong, is entitled From Development to Democracy, The Transformations of Modern Asia. I'd just like to say, after a presentation by Professor Ong, we'll have the discussants' presentations and then open things up to questions. We will abide in this session by Chatham House rules, meaning that we'd like you to check with speakers if you would like to cite anything from what they have said today. And secondly, we'd like you, if you would, if you have a question, to identify yourself before asking the question. So we can go from there and invite Professor Ong.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for the introduction and for the opening remarks. So I'm very pleased to be talking about, this book, Outsourcing Repression today, something that I've been working on for nearly a decade. So let me start with this quotation from reading Lolita in Tehran. The worst crime committed by totalitarian mindsets is that they force their citizens, including their victims, to become complicit in their crimes. Dancing with your jailer, participating in your own execution, that is an act of utmost brutality. So the puzzle that the book has posed is really, we know that, broadly speaking, state repression usually causes backlash. When you press people hard, you would expect a backlash. That's usually just common sense. So the challenge here is, how do you actually balance coerce compliance with minimizing backlash? How do you apply repression on the one hand and minimize the backlash on the other hand? That is the theoretical puzzle that the book is trying to address. Now, empirically, this book is situated in the context of urbanization in China. China's urbanization rate has risen very rapidly from under 40% in the 1990s to 51% to 2011, and is now up until 61%. Very rapid growth, but the characteristics of China's urbanization process is that it has been very much a state-led process. Right, a state-led process versus very organic type of organization, organic type of urbanization in developing countries such as India, where people go and flow into where jobs are. Whereas in China, it's a state orchestrated type of process, which is marked by state expropriation of land and state movement of people from one region to another region. And there has been massive replacement of people as a result. So even though there has been, millions of peasants which have been displaced over the last 2 or 3 decades, it has provoked relatively little resistance. There is some protest here and there, but they are usually just pockets of protest. Now, unlike in other places, like in China, like in India or Latin America, there has not been a land movement or housing movement, but only pockets of protest. So empirically, how has the Chinese state been able to engineer a massive urbanization transformation in such a short time frame? And the solution that I have proposed here is that the state has actually outsourced repression in order to augment everyday state power. And the book examines 2 key sets of non-state actors. One is the violent thugs, and the other set of actors are non-violent brokers. Now, violent thugs may sound like pretty scary set of people, but as they have been portrayed in the book cover, which I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about what should go into the book cover. As they have been portrayed in the book cover here, these are actually anonymous individuals. They are anyone from the Chinese street, and these are people who are usually unemployed, do not have a regular job, and they are mobilized as a gang in order to do a project for the government, for developers, usually to intimidate people into signing consent form. These are not gangsters. These are not organized mafias that we have heard of in Putin's Russia or in Italy, for instance. And the other set of non-state actors are brokers, and these are everyday individuals also that could be seen in Chinese neighborhoods. So 2 sets of non-state actors. The thugs for hire, they conduct everyday repression. The brokers would then use mobilizing the masses. And in combination, these mechanisms help to augment state power. I would like this book, what I would like to achieve with it, among many other things, is really to nudge or to push people to think about state repression, the boundaries of state repression, how state repression is defined and conducted. And the implication is that I think if we redefine state repression to include the state using proxies to conduct coercion, we can reimagine the contours of state power. So we typically see the country is divided into state and society, and there's a clear line in the sand that divides state and society. But if we were to reconfigure state repression, I think we can reimagine the contours of state power. And with that, I also helped try to contribute to the literature on authoritarian control. I've employed 3 empirical strategies in this research. One is ethnographic research that was conducted annually from 2011 to 2019. Secondly, an original event data set that consists of more than 2,000 land taking and demolition cases from the 90s through to the late 2010s. And number 3, a content analysis of policy documents of land taking and housing demolition issued by the central government and the cities which I've conducted field work in. And this is a map and illustration of where I have been in China in the last 10 years before zero COVID shut down its border. From 2011, I started off in Hefei province, in Zhengzhou, in Hefei city, and then went to Beijing, Kunming, which is in the southwestern side of China. Chengdu, I've been many times, and I've been able to collect quite a lot of data. And then I move on to more middle and then coastal cities such as Zhengzhou, which is fraught with a lot of governance issues, as you have seen in recent news lately. Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Tianjin. These are the coastal cities. So they are square marks on the maps. These are the cases, these are the cities which I have been and have been able to collect enough data to put together a case studies in the book. The dotted ones are cities that I have visited, but for one reason or another, I have not collected enough data to put together a case, but the quotations are actually sprinkled throughout different parts of the book. So to illustrate it, how does their everyday state power actually work? So outsourcing repression is a two-step process. So the state would first marshal a small group of society to become proxies. And then that group of proxies would then repress or mobilize the masses, right? So this is outsourcing repression is a two-step process. And the scope condition is one of complicity of proxies. Proxies must be complicit to state actions in order to allow for outsourcing repression to happen. Now, with that, I think it gives rise to three different dimensions of state power. One is participation of a small group of society who are the proxies, the acquiescence of the larger society with the help of the proxies, and in some cases, we even have legitimation of state power because these brokers draw on their own social capital to conduct persuasion, which helps to legitimate state power. So focusing on thugs for hire, who are these people? They are ruffians, they are hooligans, they are hoodlums, street gangsters, and legalized professionals who render violence for a for-profit service. They are usually comprised of the unemployed or people who make trouble for a living, right? They are actually quite distinct from the mafias, from the Japanese Yakuza or the Russian violent entrepreneurs. If I were to put it in along two axes, which is the capacity for violence as well as the nature of the force, thugs for hire will fall into this quadrant where they exercise private force on the one hand versus the police, the military that exercise public force, but their capacity for violence are actually very low to other type of violent actors that existing studies have actually conducted research on. But even though they have low capacity for violence, they are perpetrators of illegal or illegitimate acts, and they are hired to meet local government's unfunded mandates, and their non-state identity actually helps to offer pretense of plausible deniability, which is the benefit of hiring someone who do not wear uniform to carry out state coercion. But there are also costs involved. So if these untrained thugs were hired, if they use excessive violence, you get into an agency problem. And that might lead to accountability issue. In the case studies, I illustrate how agency problems arises, and which has led to accountability of local leaders. Some local leaders were punished as a result for engaging thugs for hire on a prevalent basis. It would also risk usurpation of state capacity, because you imagine that these people, if they evolve over time to become more organized gangsters and mafia groups, they will eventually eat into the state's power. Now, the other type of non-state actors that I've examined are brokers. These are non-violent brokers who help to connect state and society. Now, because of the high cost of mobilizing every member of the society, a state actually needs brokers to connect with the masses, right? And these political brokers, their power comes from state authority. They are people from urban communities and neighborhood communities. The other type of brokers are social brokers whose power comes from the social capital they command, right? The third type are economic brokers. These are really profit-making intermediaries. They have the capacity to reduce information asymmetry between the state and society. And the analogy here is to think about them as ticket scalpers. Now, some of you, I don't know about you, when I do ticket scalping these days, I do it online. But 10 years ago, I used to stand outside Messy Hall, and before a concert, I arrive an hour in advance, you see those people walking around trying to get people to buy tickets. And these people have extra tickets because they have backdoor connection to people in the ticket office, right? And same with these economic brokers. These are people who have been through demolition before. They have backdoor access, usually corrupt access to people in the demolition office. So they could actually help their clients to negotiate extra compensation, and then extra compensation is then split between the brokers as well as the client. So, everyone is a win-win-win party. No one has actually an incentive to blow the whistle. But the focus of this book is really on social brokers because of how prevalent they are and the important role that they play in connecting state and society. So these are mostly community volunteers and enthusiasts. As you can see in the picture here, they are on average your neighborhood aunties, people that you actually grow up with and you know on an everyday basis. And there's actually a lot of social trust involved. So the way to think about them is really like they are an octopus. So these brokers, they are like the tentacles of an octopus. So you think about the state is able to use its tentacles or its brokers to deeply penetrate society and to grip society, right? So these brokers actually play a really important role in helping the state reach and penetrate deeply into society and implement very challenging everyday policies. These are some of my statistical findings. I will just flash them. Among the different types of agents being deployed to conduct violent acts, you will see that thugs, they're actually the third highest just after government officials and state security. They're also very likely to be deployed to conduct very violent acts. However, they have very low or negative marginal effects on nonviolent citizen responses. As you could see, the first bar over in every diagram are those of thugs. They usually have either very low or negative marginal effects compared to other types of violent agents. They are also less likely compared to other agent types, particularly government officials, in encouraging, in provoking violent citizen responses. So if you like, I think those statistical findings illustrate the marginal effects of an average case, right? But there are instances where excessive violence are being used. And that is where my ethnographic studies come in. So I looked up the newspapers and I looked for protest cases where excessive violence have happened and that have provoked a lot of resistance and large scale mobilization. And I went to go and visit those sites. So these are in a way, there's selection bias in the way that I select my cases. And these are, if I could put it that way, failed cases of everyday repression by thugs for hire. And in those cases, I illustrate the benefits of how when excessive violence were used, it denied the hiring authority the benefit of plausible deniability as well as evasion of accountability. So outsourcing violence in those cases would actually usurp state capacity. So the consequences are that in some of the cases, I've illustrated that local governors and local party secretaries have been punished. They have been removed from their position and then put on trial for what they have done. They are usually trial under the pretext of corruption, but as you know, is a big umbrella that a lot of government officials are being charged for. This is a case that happens in Shanghai in 2005. These people set fire to the neighborhood, wanted to intimidate people into moving away. But what happened was that they ended up killing an old couple, elderly couple, 80 years old. And that arson and the death of the old couple then make made this a very sensational case. So even though that happened in 2005 until this day, which was, I think, in 2018 or 2019 when I was there, they have not managed to demolish the house. And this is like some 15 years apart. So I interviewed one of the residents, Mr. Chen, who used to live there. Anyone who has been to Shanghai would know that the Xuhui district is right in the former French concession area. It has one of the most expensive real estate in the world. And to see this empty land and these half demolished houses in the middle of Xuhui district was something that actually bothered me. So I decided to take a look. I discovered this case actually by accident. I was actually in Shanghai for a conference, but I walked around and discovered this. It was a very worthwhile experience to look into this case. The second case I looked at is a village in Kunming in southeastern province of Yunnan, where the government has also used violent techniques to grab land and to demolish houses. The pictures here illustrate a bunch of elderly women. They have decided to sit in order to prevent demolition, because this is a society that actually, they have a lot of respect for the elderly. So it's an attempt to prevent demolition. The third case in Zhengzhou in Henan province, you see a banner war. So when the government put up the red banner saying that demolition is good for you, the next day the villagers would resist and put up white banners and say that we disagree and we think we are being cheated by the government. And in both the case of Kunming and Zhengzhou, eventually the party secretaries or the governors in charge of demolition were punished because too much violence was being used. Coming to the non-state brokers, these are the people who collect intimate and personal information about individuals. So in a way, social brokers are unlike political brokers who have political authority because they are appointed by the state. And economic brokers are people who broker between state and society for a profit. Whereas these social brokers, they actually draw on their social capital and they are trusted by citizens, and therefore they are able to do a lot of social intermediation. So they are able to, they have a much better capacity to collect very personal information about households. You would imagine this sort of information is actually very important in cases of demolition, because the government needs to know the relationship between, let's say, spouses, between sons and daughters, in order to see where they can actually put pressure on. And these brokers, they are capable of mediating conflicts. They are also just as capable of manufacturing conflicts and resolving them. So they are really mobilizing vehicle for the state, and even on some occasions, they are able to legitimize state functions. State actions, I should say. This table shows you that among the various non-state type of non-state coercive act, thought work, which is persuasion conducted by social brokers, they are able to achieve compliance on a much higher basis compared to other type of state actions. When thought work is being deployed, you have 79% compliance rate and 21% resistance, compared to collective punishment, welfare suspension, and financial rewards even are not able to achieve compliance to such a high degree as thought work do. So thought work, the Chinese would say 做思想工作. So what it does is they sit down with you for hours and hours to talk about it, and to trying to persuade you, drawing on the grammar of emotions, and a lot of psychological type of techniques. And I use a range of case studies to illustrate how social brokers actually conduct what the government calls harmonious demolition. Harmonious, the word is being used because there's no violence involved, but it doesn't actually necessarily result in harmonious relationship among the community members. It just means that, you know, there's actually no violence involved. So I have a range of, I have three cases from Shanghai and from Chengdu. So in chapter 7, a chapter before conclusion, I looked at case of South Korea pre and post democratization. Basically that as, offer that as a most similar case studies, because South Korea, like China, has very strong state capacity. They also have similar cultural characteristics compared to China, where state is very strong and has very strong penetration into society. India, on the other hand, I think offers an interesting, most dissimilar case studies because the society is very fragmented. State is also relatively weaker. So you have urban slums in India where the state cannot actually penetrate, where they are actually run by slum mafias, right? So slum mafias would actually, you know, be able to promise local politicians with vote banks, right? And they are able to deliver a lot of votes, and therefore local state would actually have to listen, or sometimes being held ransom by these brokers between state and society. In a way, India is a country full of brokers, right? Like in China, this middle layer between state and society are very strong. But the difference with China is that this middle layer in India actually has a lot of power. And a lot of times they actually do not listen to the state. They could actually bargain with the state on behalf of society. I also looked at, you know, Russia in different contexts under Yeltsin and during the transition period, which is a lot weaker compared during to Putin's Russia. Well, until recently anyway. And looked at how use of violence and outsourcing of violence to violent entrepreneurs, how they actually differ from the Chinese case. So I'll end with some concluding remarks, which is what I said in the concluding chapter. So I looked at how outsourcing repression is being applied beyond urbanization, such as in the implementation of zero COVID cases. Now, if you have been looking at social media pictures as well as the news, you'll be seeing a lot of people in white hazmat suits in China, right? These are people who take temperatures, who would administer COVID tests, would try to control people's movement on an everyday basis, right? It's this everyday interaction between state and society. So what happened is most of these people are actually volunteers. These are local people who are trusted by the society, and that is how they could actually acquire compliance from the society to some of these very stringent policies. But there's a limit to how much social brokers can actually do on behalf of the state, as we have seen with, you know, recent backlash with zero COVID. I think it illustrates the limitation of social brokers. I also looked at Sweeping Black campaign, which is a signature campaign introduced by Xi Jinping at the beginning of his tenure. So when I first started this project, I spoke to Western scholars as well as, you know, Chinese scholars too, about what I call, you know, thugs for hire, where the state regularly hire and mobilize gangsters to get dirty jobs done. Most of the time, people would be looking at me with utter disbelief, you know, suggesting that, you know, this is communist China that you're talking about. Where do you find these gangsters, right? But I think over the last 10 years, as the fiscal situation of local governments evolved over time, worsened over time, and the reputation and legitimacy of local governments worsened over time, which, you know, some of our discussants have actually written on. These gangsters have actually grown to become more powerful. And Xi Jinping's Sweeping Black campaign is targeted as different type of violent actors. But one of the many types being targeted are actually these violent thugs at the very grassroots level that were mobilized by the state to conduct repression. So in a way, I see it as a vindication of my earlier findings. Thanks to Xi Jinping. And I also look at the implications for China's political future. I think in my view, the regime has been very stable. It has been able to exercise its everyday state power on a constant basis because it has very strong penetration into society and is able to mobilize local brokers that way. But I think up until recently, its style of repression has also taken on a different nature with more violent, overt type of repression in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Hong Kong. I think that raises questions about China's political future. In the end, I also spent a little bit of time talking about the future of field research in China. I see zero COVID and Xi Jinping's second term as a little bit of the end of an era where China scholars have had the privilege, including myself, have had the privilege of doing this sort of underground grassroots ethnographic research in China. I think that period has ended quite categorically, partly because of zero COVID and partly because of the change in political environment. So I'll leave it here. And I would like to end with thanking the Asian Institute as well as the Monk media and event teams for making these events possible. I look forward to your commentaries. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lynette. So we turn now to commentary by Professor Min-Shin Pei.
Okay, well, thank you. First, congratulations to Lynette for publishing such a wonderful book. I have to say, I've read a lot of recent books on China. This stands out as not just theoretically original and empirically interesting. It's actually on a very important topic. Increasingly in the China field, and as in many other fields, we see an oversupply of works on topics that a lot of country specialists might not consider truly important. This one is an exception. What I like about the book is first, I think its originality. It is, even though Lynette did not talk about it in her introduction of the book, I would say that the most interesting, really quite creative approach she took was to flip James Scott's idea or concept of everyday resistance on its head. She looks at everyday resistance from the oppressor's point of view. That is, what is about everyday oppression or everyday state power. And I think this change of perspective gives us a much better idea of what, a much better understanding of the scope, instruments, purpose, and the trade-offs of repression in an authoritarian regime. So that's why I think that in theoretical terms, Lynette's book does make a quite substantive contribution to the study of authoritarian politics. Another original aspect of the book is something Lynette just has mentioned, that is social brokerage. When you talk about repression, most of us immediately would gravitate toward violent acts of repression. But there is a much more subtle and perhaps more effective instrument authoritarian regimes deploy, and that is to use high status individuals to mobilize their resources and to engage in emotional or political manipulation to demobilize political opposition or gain compliance. So I think the dual focus in the book, both on violent acts of repression by thugs and also by nonviolent acts of manipulation, emotional manipulation by high-sense individuals, gives us a much better picture of the repressive capacity of authoritarian regimes. When I think my own work also shows that the formal apparatus of repression is relatively small in a dictatorship such as China, but include informal components of this apparatus, then it is really quite large. And that may explain why such regimes tend to be more resilient and tend to be more capable of surviving or getting through crises than we normally expect. Second, I think the book empirically really fills an important gap in Chinese studies. We have long observed the use of thugs. I've read news reports, I've read a Chinese journalist's book on the use of thugs. But I think Lynette is the first academic scholar to have studied this phenomena comprehensively, and also to develop a theoretical framework to analyze this. And her explanations for the use of thugs and social brokers are quite persuasive. And I think her study really enriches our knowledge of the role of repression in local politics. And third, in terms of methodology and research design, I think Lynette's work is very well executed. It uses not just statistical analysis, but also she complements that with in-depth case studies. So you can understand both the problem at a much more macro level, but also you gain knowledge, gain an understanding of the problem at with much better details. So these are all the praises for the book, but I have sort of three comments that are not criticism, but they are suggestions. First, I think Lynette probably needs to emphasize the issue of regime type. The Chinese regime is not your garden variety dictatorship. It is a Leninist regime with really extensive reach and very deep reach in Chinese society. Can other, even though I think as Lynette's work shows that thugs for hire, social brokerage, you can find them in other societies. Nevertheless, I think the effectiveness, the scope of their deployment are quite different in China. So I think this issue is addressed implicitly in Lynette's work. I would prefer this issue, the regime type issue, be addressed much more explicitly to show that why the Chinese system is much more capable of not just deploying thugs. I think it's much more capable of deploying social brokers, because the Communist Party's presence throughout Chinese society and its ability to mobilize social capital. So that's just one issue. The other issue is that this work is really a bottom-up, takes a bottom-up perspective. It looks at the problem or the question of hiring thugs from the perspective of local officials. I would like to see, perhaps in another project, in an article, how this issue is looked at from top down, because ruling elites at the top level view this issue from a very different perspective. Their calculations, interests actually quite differ from local officials. What works for local officials could be quite costly for higher level Chinese officials. So that's why they would take steps to punish local officials who stepped out of line in terms of the use of violence and the consequences. So that's second. Third is quite facetious. I just noticed the cover of the book, and the thug is carrying a baseball bat. In China, they don't play baseball, so I think you need to sort of replace it with a different kind of weapon. Anyway, this is just sort of some kind of I want to end on a humorous note. But overall, I think it's a very successful scholarly effort, and I again want to extend my congratulations.
Thank you very much. So now we'll turn to Professor Andrew Murtha.
Thank you very much, and I hope that you can all hear me. I think I've always been told never to start with an apology, but I'm going to anyway. When I agreed to do this, first of all, I was honored to do this, but when I agreed to do it, it was I was teaching on Tuesday afternoons. That has now been subsequently switched to Thursday. So I'm actually on kind of midway between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. So I apologize, and I hope that people can hear me and understand what I'm saying. I'd like to thank the Department of Political Science, the Munk School, and everybody who's been involved in putting together this wonderful event. And I'm also very sorry that I couldn't be there in person. Toronto is one of my favorite cities, and the University of Toronto and the Munk School, frankly, one of the top centers of the study of Chinese domestic and international politics in North America, if not the world. So I really am truly honored to be here. In preparing my remarks for today, I thought back to a time that was so ephemeral that sometimes I question its actual existence, even though I was there and can still recall its uniqueness with several of my five senses. This was Shanghai in the summer of 1995. I just finished my first year of graduate school, and I was seriously questioning my ability to continue as I did some consulting for an old toy company that I'd worked for from 1991 to 1994. Those 3 months in China took me all over the country, but I spent most of them in Shanghai. The city was unrecognizable then from what it has become. And the summer of 1995 was, in some ways, a transition period, an inflection point that connected the past to the future by quite literally destroying the then present. Entire city blocks and even neighborhoods were being destroyed to build upon. The sound of jackhammers was ubiquitous. The smell of unsettled dust and other particles that rose from the destruction settled in my nasal cavity and in my lungs. Hopefully that's not TMI. And the destruction, although taking place in peacetime, obviously, reminded me of nothing so much as the old photographs I had seen of Berlin, Dresden, and Warsaw after the Second World War. As I said, it took place in peacetime, but it was a violent act, a violent break with the past, the physical annihilation of buildings and centuries-old social spaces, and the subordination of individuals to an unspecified greater good. But what really intrigued me was the fact that the local governments had employed thugs and gangsters as hired hands to do a certain amount of this dirty work. Not the police, not the military, but as Lynette calls them, thugs. This is fascinating to me. But at the time, I couldn't even begin to think about how one might explain that dark part of urban renewal in China. Enter Lynette Ong. Now, I've followed Lynette for some time, first from afar, and then from a position of an interested colleague / fellow traveler, and now to one of a genuine enthusiastic fan of her work. We are celebrating outsourcing repression, as we should be. But placing it within the context of the substantial effort it took to pull off such a magisterial work of scholarship only enhances it as a key text in the study of state-society relations in China moving forward. Indeed, a systematic reading of Lynette's work leading up to outsourcing repression demonstrates to me the fearlessness of her fieldwork and the richness of her scholarly inquiry. She's carved out a research agenda that is very much her own, leaving few stones unturned in terms of getting at her string of research questions and answering them, all centering around how to explain the delegation of authority to non-state actors as a way of maximizing state power in an authoritarian state. There have already been many bites of the state and society relations in China apple. Professor Ong's colleague, Diana Fu, is another shining example of this. Sometimes, as in my own work on political pluralization and hydropower and other policy areas in China, increasingly feel like a time capsule, explaining a distinct era in China's political development. Professor Ong's work, by contrast, is more of a motion picture than that of a snapshot. And the fact that she captured in real time these changes in the ways in which the Chinese party state managed this particularly challenging and widespread dimension in state-society relations gives her work a pervasive degree of authenticity. This is work that requires self-confidence, patience, maturity, and grit. She tells us about the political logic of the push towards urbanization, its effects on people displaced in the process, and to a lesser extent on the municipalities themselves. Her variables of interest is state policy, specifically the establishment of concentrated villages. And she tells a compelling story about how national concerns, in this case, combined with local political and economic incentives, that is land commercialization and promotion prospects. She catalogs the negative social and economic impacts on the displaced populations, essentially creating the explorative conditions for just the body of her work over the past few years, suggested by the question, how do local governments undertake such unpopular policies without risking social unrest? As it turns out, the answer depends on when exactly we are talking about, as the policies themselves have evolved over time, as we see in this wonderful book. Initially, local authorities farm out the dirty work to thugs for hire. We see germs of Lynette's larger argument in that by employing non-state actors, local governments give themselves plausible deniability, as she herself has said in her presentation. She touches upon a fundamental question of the role of the state. When the state deploys third-party thuggish violence, it is relinquishing its territorial monopoly of legitimate violence. Moreover, she dispenses with any suggestion that this is just a few bad apples by choosing research sites as diverse as Anhui, Yunnan, Sichuan, and Henan, as well as various administrative levels, including the Jiedao, the Chongzhongcun, the Shequ, and the Shangfangcun within them. She provides a fascinating picture of strategies, organizations, and outcomes, but this stage of her research begs another key question. How sustainable is this, as it clearly erodes legitimacy of the regime at the local level? And this is where the Huangnio come in. The Huangnio are state-sanctioned brokers that mitigate the distances between local governments and aggrieved citizens through negotiations. This lowers the cost to regime legitimacy from violent evictions and creates a vital pressure valve for social discontent. These middlemen provide a key service and inhabit a fascinating no man's land within the membrane adjacent to Chinese state and of Chinese society. Quite apart from its empirical innovation, Lynette provides us with an overdue updating of the state in Chinese society, what she calls the post-violence era in China's cities. In short, Professor Ong is, quote, reimagining what constitutes state power, as she puts it, as local state representatives both employ everyday repression as well as mobilize the masses, or a strategic segment thereof, to capture or recapture state legitimacy consistent with more fundamental norms of the Chinese state, going back to Mao. On page 21, she puts it particularly well, quote, everyday state power is the state's exercise of power through society. The scholarship represented in Outsourcing Repression is unquestionably and unapologetically, if you'll excuse my language, badass scholarship. It is likely something of which we are going to see less and less as the areas of political contention and of access become increasingly curtailed. But frankly, we did not see much of it when we could engage in it. What it represents is thus even more precious as we hold it up as not only pointing to a different time in China, even as we are only talking about a few years in the past, but also as a pushing of the empirical and scholarly envelope of inquiry into how the sausage is made in China, what the dark underbelly looks like, and the outer bands of what is possible in our own scholarship if we work hard and smart enough. Let me just conclude with three questions. The first has to do with, I'm wondering conceptually, how do you situate what you find empirically, Lynette, vis-a-vis Dung and O'Brien's concept of relational repression? The second question has to do with, you had brought up the idea of thought work, and I think that is fascinating. I'd love to hear more about how that's a particular area where I think the state would be loath to delegate and give up its monopoly on that. And I'm really, really curious how that mechanism actually works. And then finally, where does plausible deniability end and actual deniability begin? Which is to say, at what administrative levels are we talking about that are knowledgeable of what's going on and make the money and other incentives available? And at what point can officials, at what administrative level can officials say that we really, we have no idea what you're talking about and pass a lie detector test? So I've taken up more than enough time. Let me stop here. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this event and to read this wonderful book.
Thank you very much, Professor Murtha. Okay, so we turn to our third discussant at this stage, Professor Dan Slater of the University of Michigan. Professor Slater.
Hi. Sorry about these stripes coming through the window blinds. I feel like a Bengal tiger at the moment. So I'm really sorry I can't be there. Like Andy, would love to be up in Toronto for this great event. And really, this is the first time that I've ever celebrated and participated in not just one, but two book launches by the same author in the same year. Because contrary to what we heard at the outset, there was a book launch that Lynette did. She just did it in DC rather than Toronto on, as you've heard, her the other book she just published in the past year, which is the Cambridge Elements on Malaysian Protests and Elections, which we did back in March. So obviously it's been a really remarkable year for Lynette. It's really displaying a remarkable range of scholarship. And so I just want to add my congratulations to you on top of what we've already heard. We've heard a lot already from Lynette and from Min-Shin and from Andy. So what can I add? So I guess what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about what struck me the most when reading the book. Like what sort of jumped out to me as something that was both sort of surprising to some degree, but also just gave me a lot of food for thought about what comes next in China. And so for me, there's really two notions in the book that really, really leaped out at me. And that was proxies and persuasion. So as you've heard in Lynette's presentation and in Min-Shin and Andy's remarks, a central lesson of Lynette's book of Outsourcing Repression is that the CCP surprisingly relies quite a bit on proxies, and it is increasingly, surprisingly reliant on persuasion to rule. Okay, so proxies and persuasion are sort of at the heart of the argument that she makes here. And I think one reason that these jump out to me is because in the wake of the book that I've just published with Joe Wong about essentially democracy through strength and why authoritarian regimes might choose to open up the political system and choose to like compete on a level playing field as a way of rejuvenating their legitimacy, as a way of dividing their opponents, and as a way of trying to continue to thrive, but as a democratic party rather than an authoritarian party, like much like the KMT did. You know, so one question that I keep getting asked is like whether the CCP could actually do this. And I know Joe and I have both been thinking a lot about this question of whether, I mean, as the CCP gets stronger, does it get closer to or further from a possible democratization scenario? It certainly gets further from a collapse scenario, but possibly becomes closer to a concession scenario. But the key to that question is, I think, not so much what's in the head of Xi Jinping, but I think the question that we can try to address is what would happen to China's governance model if they were to open up the system, if they were to allow multi-party elections, if they were to allow a freer press, if they were to allow more freedom of assembly, if it would do basically those minimal things that level the playing field and allow some kind of multi-party democracy to emerge, what would that do? And what Lynette has given us with this discussion of proxies and of persuasion is, I'm wondering what if the single party monopoly were to be relaxed, what it would do to those features of governance in China. Because it seems to me that much of the case when leaders such as those in the CCP make the case for authoritarianism and others around the world, the argument often comes down to sort of a smooth sailing argument. The idea is that, well, if you're a single party authoritarian regime, you don't have to deal with all these headaches. You can do things much more efficiently, do things much more directly. You don't have to negotiate. You don't have to worry about public opinion and these sorts of things, right? But it just seems to me that all of these things seem all not very true in China. If it's the case that, and I think Lynette makes a compelling case that they do, if the CCP already has to govern through proxies, and if the CCP already has to achieve persuasion to govern, it seems to me the CCP is already, with its current model, experiencing a lot of headaches, the kind of headaches we usually associate with democracy. And it doesn't end there. If we think about some other books that have come out recently on Chinese politics. So as Manfred Elstrom's terrific book, Workers and Change in China, shows, that the CCP has a very strong felt need to be responsive in response to protest and to basically keep labor quiescent. So it's not as if there's no repression means they don't need to respond. As Elstrom shows, the repression that we see in China needs to be complemented with a lot of response, particularly in terms of the kind of economic distribution that we might think, well, if you're a democracy, you have to do that. If you're a dictatorship, you don't. But the CCP does need to do that. We've also learned from Isa Ding's new book, The Performative State, that even when the CCP can't deliver, it's really hard pressed to be performatively benevolent, right? And so again, to do this kind of image crafting and to go through those kinds of headaches as well. So when we add up the lessons of these books, it seems as if in China right now, repression is getting a lot costlier. Distribution is growing and pressures for distribution keep growing. Scrutiny into the state is intensifying, and persuasion is increasingly necessary to govern. So I think about these lessons in tandem and think, well, what about this is smooth sailing? What headaches is the CCP saving itself as opposed to suffering by continuing with the kind of regime closure that it's currently practicing, and in fact, even increasing under Xi Jinping? So this sort of leads to my question for Lynette. If China were to just embrace a level of pluralism, something like Malaysia, for instance, or Singapore, cases you also know quite well, what would it do to these particular practices? Like in particular, what would it mean for these use of proxies? What would it mean for the reliance on persuasion that we see in China today? And in particular, when we read about these social brokers who really, to me, they echo what we read about in Lily Tsai's book, these social brokers seem to me to be exactly the kind of local actors who have legitimacy, have local popularity, who could actually be repurposed in a different kind of system where the CCP would be winning local elections and pursuing local governance in a more democratic manner. And as you showed with your comparisons to South Korea and India, the kind of things you're talking about here are not exclusive to authoritarianism. Democracies also use thugs for hire. Democracies also use these kind of proxies and mobilize them for purposes of governance, right? So the South Korea and India comparisons are obviously really interesting and informative, but I'm wondering, what about a democratic China as opposed to a democratic Korea or India? And you clearly show, and we clearly know, that in recent years, Xi Jinping has been using a lot more repression. But you show, we argue, especially in urban areas, that there's this real decline of repression at a deeper level. So this move away from repression, which I think would be surprising to many readers, and especially that it's as recent as 2019 that we see this decline of repression. So I would just kind of like to conclude and open things up by sort of asking you how you currently see these cross-cutting trends on which you sort of end the book, which is, on the one hand, we have this growing obsession with control under Xi Jinping. So a very clear repressive trend. But on the other hand, for these deeper underlying reasons, we're seeing the rising costliness of repression in China. So we really have, it's a little bit of a structure versus agency story, right? That on the one hand, that the particular leaders seem to be much more willing to use repression, however much they need to. But on the other hand, there are these reasons to think it's going to be harder and harder for them to do so. So I'm just wondering if, I mean, as you watch Chinese politics on a day-to-day basis, what do you think about these two trends? And how do you think that is playing out? So I think your book gives us some really good tools for thinking about that kind of question. And, you know, look forward to, I mean, having this discussion with Andy and Min-Chin and with Joe and with the audience at Toronto as well. So congratulations again, terrific book, and learned a lot from reading it. So well done.
Thank you very much. So we've had 3 sets of excellent questions and challenges, a lot to think about here. And we will give Professor Lynette Ong 10 or 15 minutes to talk about what occurs to her at the moment.
Sure. I'm not sure whether I actually need 10 or 15 minutes because these are great questions that I'm sure I'll be thinking about them for the next couple of years as I develop my future research agenda. So I'll start with Dan's questions as they are still fresh on my mind. And I think as you and Joe's recent book have persuasively argued, the normative way for a lot of countries, particularly a strong state like China, to carry forward is really to democratize while they are still strong, right? When we put some flesh into the meat, so to speak, looking at how the functions, the important functions of proxies and the mechanism with which they use to mobilize the masses, such as using persuasion. I think if China were to become a multi-party democracies, these people would be playing a very important role. These people meaning proxies. I would imagine they will play a very important role in persuading people to vote for CCP's transform party, whatever that party may be. So looking at the very close case to China, such as Singapore, if this were to happen in Singapore, I would imagine those neighborhood committees, neighborhood aunties would be trying to court and votes on behalf of the PAP. So that would be in the context of the literature of voter mobilization, like your colleague Ellen Hicken and Meredith Wyeth has, recently written a fantastic book about voter mobilization. So I think the proxies would be using similar persuasion techniques in a multi-democracy China, if that were to happen. To Andy's point, I'm glad to hear that my book is offering a motion picture, versus snapshots. I think the motion picture has also evolved over time, right? The characters have actually changed, and the lessons that we should be drawing from the motion picture has also changed over the last decade, with which I had the privilege to witness and to document. In relation to Zheng Yanhua's and Kevin O'Brien's relational repression, I think the concept is similar. I think relational repression gets at the nature of the repression, which is the drawing on and exercise of social relations to exercise repression. But the second half of my book is really, I think, and I hope that I've provided a more holistic picture of how this sort of repression is conducted by differentiating different sort of non-state brokers that are trying to exercise similar repression, and the varying degree of success from economic brokers to political brokers to social brokers, depending on the degree of social capital they actually possess. I think the success of relational repression is very much contingent on how much social trust the society has on these sort of brokers. And I think the outcome variables, qualitatively, they varies depending on the type of the brokers which is doing the intermediation. I think, thought work is something that is not new in China at all. Liz Perry has published about thought work some 20, 30 years ago, and we have seen how that was carried out back in the 50s and 60s. And what I was hoping to contribute is really to take thought work in very China study sense and put it in more theoretical comparative literature and think about how that actually operates and contribute to the literature on state repression and state power. We have learned a lot about how it works in China's context. I was trying to do this mental gymnasium of how that could actually, mental gymnastics of how that actually works if you were to kind of put it in larger context of what state repression actually means in political science. Plausible deniability versus actual deniability. Plausible deniability meaning that you are not given deniability 100% of the time. It's only plausible if there's no agency problems, as I have shown in my case studies. When excessive violence is being used, when there's accountability issue, you actually don't get to have deniability. So it becomes only plausible when certain conditions are met. On Min-Xin's point, yes, the CCP is not a garden variety type of regime. It is very much a regime type on its own. And as we speak, it is also evolving under Xi Jinping, as with the coming up, the party congress that is coming up. You are absolutely right that I think this book offers a bottom-up perspective of state repression and everyday state power, because I think that is where the evidence lies. I have no connection to Zhongnanhai. I have no connection to Beijing, and I suspect that this sort of research is always like elite research in authoritarian countries, especially China, is always difficult to conduct, and it's more and more difficult under Xi Jinping. However, with policy documents, which is one of my empirical strategies, what I was trying to achieve is that by doing content analysis and looking at word frequency and some of the terms and used, I was trying to get the glimpse of what it looks like from the policy makers' perspective. And these are central policy makers as well as policy makers from different municipalities. But you are right, if you are able to provide a more top-down type of approach, that would be very valuable. The question has always been, evidence in terms of elite politics. On the book cover, and I think I have just given away the fact that my illustrator is actually a Westerner, not a Chinese. But that's a different subject on its own. It would be, I would have loved to have a Chinese design the book cover, but for a number of reasons, some Chinese have actually turned down my generous offer, probably for obvious reasons. So I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so at this stage, we're going to shift to questions from the audience, both the in-person and online audience. And I'll just invite those who wish to come up to the microphone. Please introduce yourself and ask a question. And we'll go from there. There are a couple of questions online. We'll get to them in a second. Thank you.
I think I'm the first one. I think Dr. On's book is an
introduce
impressive.
Yourself, please.
Oh,
sorry.
My name is Alfred Chan, Huron University College, University of Western Ontario. I'd like to congratulate Dr. On a very impressive piece of scholarship, and she has set standard that is that are really difficult to follow. I am intrigued by the notions of contract out, third-party coercion, proxies, and everyday power. I'm also fascinated by your comparison with South Korea, Russia, and India. But then it got me thinking about this contract out. If we look at democracies, for example, externally, the United States and Russia certainly has contract out. We're talking about the Blackwaters, the Wagners, mercenaries working outside of the US border to conduct regularly military and security activities. And internally, in the United States, there are also private prisons. We all know that prisons is one aspect of a coercive aspect of state society. We also know that the incarceration rate in the United States is very high. And we also know that disproportionately, many African Americans are incarcerated in those private prisons for profit. So it got me thinking. I'm not sure whether you have thought in terms of those lines. This is just a suggestion that if you include those phenomena, you might give your study even a broader comparative perspective, and perhaps even you'll be able to arrive at even more theoretical contributions. And perhaps the last thing, by doing comparative analysis, we might move away from the binary representation of authoritarianism and democracy. I think Professor Slater made it very nicely by saying that even democracies also use proxies in many of his policies. I'm not sure whether you have thought about that. If not, this is just a suggestions for further research. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. Let me put it this way. It was actually by reading IR scholars and comparativist work on mercenaries used by the United States that actually inspired me to theorize and frame my book that way. So am I aware of it? Definitely. And if you have actually, you said that you have not read the book, but you know, I talk about it quite extensively actually in chapter 1, chapter 2, as well as chapter 8. And I think in a democracy like the United States, for instance, as well as other democracies, also similarly draw on proxies to do dirty work. But I think the difference with authoritarian states is that they are able to actually avoid accountability much better than democracies do, because in democracies, you have stronger civil society, media, and other checks and balances that would actually deny possible deniability to even a greater extent compared to in China.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. All right, Kent Morelli.
Kanta Murli, Political Science, U of T. Lynette, I just wanted to start off by congratulating you on a highly impressive and important work of scholarship. But I had two questions, and this comes in thinking a little bit about the comparative element too, and following from some of the commentators' questions. One is that just as a non-China specialist, I'm trying to think about and this is possibly outside the scope of your book, but thinking about how the state achieves compliance with the brokers, right? So there's a significant principal agent problem here built in, and given the scale of this, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the tools the state actually uses to achieve control of over its brokers. And as you pointed out, the comparative cases of India and South Korea, that's in many ways where the differences lie of how the state achieves this compliance. The second part of this, and I think it follows a little bit from Dan Slater's comment, is that as well as Min Chin-pei's comment, is that in the first place that I'm thinking about the relationship between prior state capacity and the effectiveness of these proxies. So in this particular case, it's prior state capacity and reach of the CCP and the Chinese state, et cetera, that allows this scale of effectiveness of proxies in some ways. But at the same time, as I think Dan was hinting at, is essentially it's also sowing the seeds of destruction of that very state power that brought this about in the first place, right? That by increasingly giving control to the brokers, you're essentially over the long run, presumably eating into the capacity of the state as well, at least the formal state in its more administrative element of that. So in that sense, I'm just wondering, thinking of time horizon, what the nature of calculations there is in terms of the Chinese state. And it's so in a sense, it seems to be weakening, as Dan tried to point out, its power in over the long term in some ways. But thank you for an outstanding book.
Okay, great. No, these are thoughtful questions. So outsourcing repression involve a two-step process, and scope condition comes in. And I think there are two scope conditions, as I've laid out in the book. One is the state must have control and strength over the proxies. You could hire someone to do the job for you, but if you have no control over someone, because you have no capacity over them to discipline them, as sometimes it happens with thugs for hire, then the proxies might actually turn around and bite you, as they have in certain cases with very violent demolition that eventually get the local leaders into trouble. The other scope condition is the proxies must genuinely believe that they are actually doing good for the society by conducting persuasion or repression on behalf of the state. And some of that might be due to political culture, but I think others in other contexts is this normative values and normative belief that proxies have, especially social brokers have, that they believe they are actually doing good to the society. So in a way, the state doesn't even need to discipline them. They hold this belief that they are doing good. Just like citizens in Singapore, they'll keep voting for the PAP, and you wonder why. And part of that, and I think it's part of the endemic political culture. So in the comparative cases, China, South Korea and India, I illustrate how when these scope conditions actually vary. For instance, in the case of India, where the state is relatively weak, right? When you have first scope condition not being met and second scope condition not being met, the implications of that, the consequence of that is that you outsource repression to proxies, but the proxies don't listen to you. They come back and bite you and get you into trouble. So I think they are actually very important. And I say that South Korea offers a very similar case study to China, precisely because I think both of these scope conditions were met, especially in pre-democratized South Korea, pre-1987, when the state also very similar to China in the 90s and 2000s for the Olympic Games, for the Seoul Asian Games held in Seoul. The municipal government mobilized a lot of gangsters to clear land, to clear slums, just to make way for international events, like China has done quite often, because the scope conditions are actually met.
Okay, great. Let's see, we have another question from the in-person audience. Go ahead.
Hi there. I just finished a master's in contemporary Chinese studies at the University of Oxford, but also a graduate of the JD program here at U of T. My name is Darcy. So my question touches on two things that were already mentioned, the dynamic of top-down versus bottom-up, but also central versus local governance. I'm really interested in your opinion about how the use of outsourced repression fits with or interacts with the use of law in China. In particular, we've seen some commentators suggest there's a turn away from liberal rule of law constitutionalism in China, but at the same time, we see perhaps a turn towards law and in the increased what some call rule by law. So my question is, how does the use of local outsourced repression fit with, the increasing reliability of judicial adjudication and greater restraint on local officials? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good question. These are extrajudicial measures of control. And like what Min-Xin has said earlier, China is no garden variety authoritarian state. It likes to use, a garden variety types of control measurements. So you could exercise, you could deploy your police, your public security, your Gong'an, your officers that wears uniform, but you could also be deploying thugs, brokers at the same time. There is actually, I have not seen a pattern or mathematical formula that could actually predict what sort of agents is being deployed at what time. But I think there is some temporal variation and there's some regional variation. Inland regions in earlier time periods tend to be more violent. Later time period that I have studied and more coastal cities tend to be less violent and more civilized, more harmonized in that way. But on an average instance, and I think local governments have a lot of pressure, have a lot of unfunded mandates. They would use any sort of control measures necessary to get the job done.
Okay, thank you. So we have some questions coming in online. I'll just read one now while you colleagues and students get your next challenges ready in the room. So we have one from Leo Zhu. It's clear that, as you pointed out in your book, the state utilizes methods such as thugs and brokers to coerce elements of society into conforming with the policy of the state. I'm wondering whether this kind of coercion has changed throughout the different eras of the CCP's reign. What do they look like, and are there distinctive features in these different eras, and any predictions about how this type of coercion will evolve?
Sure. As I've just mentioned earlier, I think the cost of using violence increasingly high for a number of reasons, because of the prevalence of social media, as well as people, especially urban citizens and urban residents, they're increasingly aware of their political rights, and they know how to bargain with the state. So in many respects, you could use violence, but the cost of using violence when things go wrong are now significantly higher. The curve goes like this, exponentially high, especially in CBD area. You imagined if someone used violence against certain citizens in central business district of Shanghai and Beijing, and someone take a snapshot of that violent incident and then upload it to the Chinese internet, even just for 10 minutes, and get taken down by censorship, as our colleagues in Citizen Lab often illustrates. Just even for 10 minutes, the cost of that brings to the reputation and legitimacy of local governments is unimaginable. People have been punished, have been removed from their positions for that sort of actions. So as far as possible, where citizens are aware of their rights, the government would actually avoid using violence against citizens, because there's hard evidence. Instead, they would be using, persuasion, non-state brokers, mobilizing the masses, drawing on social capital of these neighborhood people in order to extract compliance.
Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Let me ask a question. Sorry, Professor Pei. Yeah, you go ahead.
Well, you go ahead. I'll follow you.
All right. Okay. So Lynette Ong knows that in the Department of Political Science, I'm a political theorist. So people have come to expect sort of off the wall questions from political theorists. So let me ask one of those. If you think about, I'm thinking a lot more about the category of thought work. And I'm also fascinated by that, like Professor Murtha. Partly because if you look at the history of persuasion in theories of rhetoric and so forth, persuasion is often opposed to force. These are two, strictly opposed sorts of things. And the way that you're talking about the persuasive activity of social brokers today breaks down that distinction. Or I guess my question is, to what extent does it break down that distinction? Is persuasion still opposed to force? So what I want to understand better is what is it about the kinds of persuasion that you're talking about that does the work in making it a tool of repression? Why is it not just, okay, we're talking, now you're persuaded, done? Is it because it's harassment? Is it because it sort of lasts for hours, as you suggested? Do you actually have a choice in consenting? That sort of question I'd be interested in your thoughts on.
Right. That is a very thoughtful question. I wouldn't be expecting anything less from a political theorist.
Thank you. Thank you.
How is persuasion different from force? Is it opposed to force? I think metaphorically, persuasion is a type of force. It's a force that doesn't take physical shape. It's not violence. It's not physical violence, but metaphorically, it is actually violent. Someone could exercise persuasive force on another person, could draw on a range of psychological technique, and could emotionally blackmail the other person in order to extract compliance. Now, that is persuasion. It might not be violence. It might not have a physical shape or form, but I think it is a type of force, metaphorically speaking.
Okay. I think I see what you mean. In other words, there's not a level playing field. And the dice are loaded. It's not as though the best argument is going to win.
Right.
The social broker is going to win.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Okay, so we turn now to Professor Min-Shin Pei once again.
Yeah. Hi, Lynette. I want to ask you whether the kind of situation or the kind of phenomena you are describing in the book is something Xi Jinping may actually find quite objectionable. That is, given what we know about what he thinks about how the party should be run, hiring thugs, he doesn't, I think it won't bother him to learn that social brokerage is working, okay? He would like that. But hiring thugs is something that she probably would find quite upsetting because that conflicts with his image of a disciplined, well-organized, and compliant party organization.
No, I agree. I don't think Xi Jinping likes thugs for hire or that sort of practice at all, which is precisely what his signature campaign, his sweeping black or Sao Hei Chu He campaign is trying to get at. This sort of mobilizing gangsters or violent dark forces of the society to conduct repression on state behalf usually goes hand in hand with corruption, right? And you have this collusion between state and violent gangsters, as well as collusion between them, which is one of the many things that sweeping black and anti-corruption is trying to root out. And if you look at kind of the 10 categories of subjects that the sweeping black campaign is trying to target, people who help the government, local governments deal with demolition, deal with land expropriation. They have been explicitly singled out as a targeted group that the Sweeping Black campaign should get rid of.
Yeah. Can I have a follow-up? Do you think that will actually cause friction, if not conflict, between Xi Jinping on the one hand, the law and order party discipline guy, and the local mafia state, which is what I think what you're describing? Because the local mafia state has its parochial interests, how to benefit from demolition, how to run its business, and also fulfill various targets laid down by the central government. But what Xi Jinping is trying to do is to close off a lot of these off-the-books options for them.
Right. I don't think there will be tension. There might be some, but I think generally speaking, there is not going to be much tension, because these mafias and gangsters, I've seen some Chinese writings, they have actually turned themselves into legalized professionals. So we have seen how that happens in Taiwan. The Taiwanese call it piao bai, where you bleach yourself, white. You are black, but you bleach, meaning that you are a mafia, a gangster. You register as a security company and do legal jobs, legitimate jobs. When the political environment is not conducive, you take you go undercover, you take shelter. But once Xi Jinping is gone, campaign is not there anymore, then they will pop up again. They'll resurface and do what they are very good at. But I don't think they are gone. You cannot actually root it out. It's very difficult to root it out altogether. If there's corruption, if local governments are not funded, if unfunded mandates, those endemic conditions are still around.
Okay, thank you. We have a question in the house.
My name is John Healy. I'm a member of the public, and I like the fact that the Monk School outsources opportunities to people like me. So thank you. Lynette, I'm enjoying your lecture. I've not read your book. Enjoying the responses you got generously from the participants as well. Very, very good. Taking your ideas, and I'm not that knowledgeable, I'm thinking of maybe the COVID-19 situation in China. So there's times where the government, and one could say with a benevolent aspect now, to protect the people, that, you know what, because of an outbreak, a flare-up, we're going to ask you to stay at home. And I'm just wondering how you see some of this ideas here in terms of creating that cooperation, or is that a type of repression? Is that an overreaction by the state? That kind of idea where one could argue was for the common good. And some of these questions parallel in many other countries, including Canada. The other thing, if you can elaborate, is when you mentioned volunteering. Now, that's an interesting idea related to outsourcing repression. That is having the persuasion of citizens. And you mentioned, and this is what I want you to expand on, is that people might be volunteers in hazmat suits. They're interacting with the public, maybe coming into buildings, places of work, and things like that. I'm not sure what they're doing in terms of using that information, what kind of persuasion is going on. I don't know that well. And also some of the apps they had to have for accountability and credits and things like that, which I don't know a lot about. I wonder if you can explore the ideas of your book to that situation, which is going on now, but particularly in the weeks and months gone by.
Sure. I have a paper on how how this book about outsourcing repression and how that could help to explain the compliance, as well as more recently the resistance to zero COVID policies. And I'm waiting for that short article to be published soon. But in brief, I think the local state, they can send many different people to take temperatures 5 times a day, to control people's movement, like literally control people's movement, to administer COVID tests. They could send people who work in neighborhood committees. These are what I call political brokers, but there are only so few of them around. and the mundaneness of the job and the heavy workload, there's no way that there's sufficient people in the neighborhood committees to go around. So in a sense, they have to mobilize a larger society. This is where the volunteers comes in. In the zero COVID case, the volunteers could be people very young. I know of some PhD students, when they return to Shanghai, they get stuck in Shanghai, so they decide to volunteer. But usually these social volunteers are people in the 50s, 60s, they are retired. Well, the Chinese retire young, right? And these people would regularly volunteer because they don't have anything to do. And by volunteering, it actually helps to attain certain social status. You go walk around the neighborhood, people actually recognize you, right? Because you are the one who implement certain everyday policies. If people like to curry favor with you, maybe they are able to get some carrots out of you. People who have been, factory managers in the past love these sort of things. Otherwise, they'll be, looking after their grandkids at home. That's what they do all day. People telling me they love these things, not so much for its monetary compensation, but because of the social status they attain in the process. However, local officials also tell me it's increasingly difficult to recruit volunteers because these are older folks. And younger people do not want to volunteer anymore, where they can actually put their labor to better use. But I think from zero COVID to urbanization to demolition, and potentially if China does turn into a multi-party democracies, I think these proxies would definitely be helping the state to recruit votes.
Wonderful. I think we have time for one more question, which is online, before we turn to our closing remarks from Professor Wang. So here's an online question. Your comment about the increasing cost of violence, for instance, an incident in the CBD captured on social media, perhaps being high risk. But what about the crackdown in Hong Kong? Citizens know their rights, they're social media literate, and yet doesn't the Hong Kong experience, since imposition of the national security law, reveal that this can be done with impunity?
Yes, Hong Kong case is what I would call a failed case of thugs for hire, or a failed case of everyday repression, because excessive violence was being used. And that was captured on media, by CNN, by BBC. That's not how everyday violence is being conducted. In the cases that I have described, everyday violence is done in the middle of the night, 2 a.m., when they send someone in to commit arson, to bulldoze a house 3 a.m. in the morning while the residents are asleep, while no one is able to take snapshots and pictures of violence being committed. When the neighborhood is under spotlight, is under the scrutiny of international media, and you send a bunch of gangsters to come in to harm people, and that was like that image was all over social media and all over international media. That's just, I think the people who hire the gangsters to do that sort of job were actually denying themselves of plausible deniability at the very outset. And actually, that actually defeats the purpose of hiring thugs for hire. That's why I would call it very much a failed case. I think that's a demonstrative example of very much failed case of how outsourcing repression shouldn't be done. So why did the people do it? I think it's for intimidation purposes. It's not really to allow for plausible deniability, which is why that and how that is actually done in China, and for that purpose. In the case of Hong Kong, it was for a different set of intention.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. And I just want to thank you for my own part for such an illuminating discussion of an important facet of this complex regime. I'd like to thank the discussants and the audience. And now I'd like to invite Professor Joseph Wang of the Department of Political Science and the Munk School of Global Affairs to provide some closing remarks.
the Department of Political Science, as well as the Asian Institute. These are all formidable institutes on campus that lay claim to some of the genius that is Lynette Ong, and certainly we've seen some of the work today. So very grateful to all of those organizations and institutes around campus. I also want to thank the audience. This is the first time in a long time in which certainly I've been able to participate in a live seminar like this in person, and to see everyone together in this room again. It does seem like it was only yesterday, but actually it was almost 3 years ago since we were able to convene like this. And so I'm really grateful to all of you for lending us your presence and your time and your thoughtfulness. I also want to thank our discussants. Can't imagine 3 better discussants than Mingxing, Andy, and Dan, all of whom provided, I just thought, really thoughtful, challenging questions to Lynette, but also helped move the conversation forward. These were not meant to be destructive questions. They were meant to be constructive questions to get us all to think constructively moving forward. And indeed, they are all very good friends of yours, Lynette, and as well of the University of Toronto. And for that, we're very grateful. In many ways, a launch like this is really a celebration, right? It's a celebration of just an extraordinary achievement. For any of you in the room who've written a book before, you will know how hard it is, never mind writing 2 books. And I see Alfred there just wrote a really humongous book, actually, that is on my bookshelf right now. But to write a book takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And when you do the kind of research that Lynette has conducted in order to put all of that knowledge into a book like this, it truly is really phenomenal. The kind of research that requires you to be in the field over the course of 10 years, to do the kind of ethnographic work requires a certain fluency, obviously, and comfort in working in very uncomfortable places. And as our discussants have noted, really just extraordinary courage as well. And then to compile it all in a coherent way and in a way that's persuasive. It's not just about putting everything you know down on paper, it's about curating it and putting it into a persuasive argument, which Lynette has most certainly done with this book. It's also a celebration of Lynette's promotion, I wanted to add, to the rank of full professor, which is really an extraordinary milestone in one's career, and I think one that ought not to be taken lightly and ought to be celebrated in tandem with this book. It's not just a celebration, though, and as we saw from our colleagues' comments, it is equally as much, and I really want to congratulate Lynette for this. The book launch and the conversation we've had has really been a provocation. Her comments, her insights, Lynette's findings, and so forth, and indeed the reactions we saw from our discussants and from the audience here really reflects not only the contribution the work is making, but truly the provocation it's offering all of us. It's given all of us something to think about. Most certainly, Lynette's work has contributed to the ongoing discussion of authoritarian resilience more generally, but also authoritarian resilience in China specifically, and really highlighted for us the very dynamism that differentiates Chinese authoritarianism from the Mao period to the Deng period to the early 2000s and now to the Xi Jinping era. This is a truly dynamic regime and one that is constantly adapting. And it's in many ways that adaptation that is the source of its resilience. I thought the conversation, the exchange between Ryan and Lynette actually to be really fascinating, because I really thought of it as not a binary between persuasion and force, but what I thought you were getting at was about persuasion and coercion, and how persuasion can actually be a means of coercion, which actually got me thinking and hearkening me back to some of the earliest literature on totalitarianism and the way in which regimes function in an earlier period, in a way in which scholars talked about a kind of autocratic regime in which it really was a very fine and maybe collapsed line between persuasion and coercion. And then you have, Dan, and the Joe Wong he's referring to is me, really thinking out loud about how the need to be so persuasive may be reflective of the kinds of headaches that democracies have to endure and that autocratic regimes supposedly are able to elude and elide. And indeed, maybe we can even think creatively about persuasion and the agents of persuasion and these proxies as eventually becoming or morphing into potentially vote captains in electoral democracy. All of this is to say is that what Lynette's offered us, I think, is really just an extraordinary set of provocations. And what I love about the book, and indeed the discussion we've had today, and I'll just finish with this, is that her book is not, it's not signaling the end of the story. It is not a piece of analysis with a full stop at the end, but rather it's an invitation for continued rigorous academic, intellectual discussion, argumentation, and even some reasonable speculation. And for that, I think that truly is the greatest gift that the book offers all of us. So thank you again, Lynette, congratulations, and thank you to all of you for participating. And I think we'll break to the reception. Thank you.